Thank you very much, Professor Ludwig. Thank you very much for coming today. As Professor Gregory has said, Newcastle Business School has a very good partnership with Hochschule Heilbronn. Hochschule Heilbronn is perhaps our most important partner in Germany. So we are very proud to have this partnership. Just a few words about Newcastle Business School. Obviously, we are part of Northumbria University. Northumbria University in turn is one of the largest universities in the UK. We have approximately 30,000 full-time students. We are also ACSB accredited, so we are in the top 5% of business schools worldwide. And we are obviously into a lot of research as a business school, but one of the areas we look at as a research team as well is the resource-based view, internal analysis, dynamic capabilities. So today I would like to talk about dynamic capabilities in particular because this has been an emerging theme over the past few years, but not necessarily a theme that offers the solution for the problems. So when we talk about problems, I mean that we have to always focus on the senior management perspective. And from the senior management perspective, of course, this is a very complex world with very complex problems. So hopefully today I can offer some insight into the resource-based view of the firm and the dynamic capabilities view, but also show that there's still a lot of research to be done, and also show if there are any practical solutions for senior managers. So I would like to emphasize or focus on one particular study conducted at Newcastle Business School as well. So I will go through these themes, and after that I will open it up to any questions you may have. Obviously, first of all, we talk about dynamic capabilities, some background information. This topic, as I said, is relatively new. By relatively new, I mean it's first emerged in the 1990s. And initially, every academic and scholarly community really thought this is the solution. But we always have to measure and evaluate theories based on practical applicability. Because this subject is still business and management, and at the end of the day, if theories cannot be applied to business reality and to the real world, then we need to be very critical, right? So if the theory becomes too abstract and cannot be applied, then the value for senior managers is limited, and then the value of the theory in itself must be questioned. So I will focus on some theories nevertheless, because we need to know the theory before we can talk about application. And then I will focus on the steel industry in particular to give some practical example if you want. This is a slide that is familiar to most because it's the traditional rational deliberate, as we call it, strategy process. So in theory you follow that approach sequentially. External analysis, you identify the external threats, opportunities. Then you conduct internal analysis, identify the key issues, identify the options, select the option, and then come up with strategy, implementation, strategic change, and so on. But this is what is well known. And this so-called rational deliberate approach has come into criticism. Because obviously in business reality, it's very rare to find case study examples where you would actually find senior managers following this approach. So we will also talk about some of these issues over the next few minutes as well. So the first question we need to ask ourselves, dynamic capabilities and the resource-based view of the firm, where can we find them within the strategy process? This red box is obviously where you would identify internal analysis and capabilities. But then the big question is this really the case, right? So dynamic capabilities, are they just an internal issue? Is this an internal task? Or is there also a link with the external view? So earlier I talked about the complexity of today's business reality. So when we talk about the complexity of business reality, we need to understand that this is a very real situation. The world becomes more and more complex, and therefore one issue becomes more and more important. And that issue relates back to the strategy process. Because in the past, what was the key objective of any senior managers? What was their objective, their goal? What was the most likely outcome of this process here? Obviously, at some point, senior managers wanted to achieve competitive advantage, right? So a lot of the strategy textbooks are about competitive advantage, and then they're also about sustainability of competitive advantage. That was the traditional case. But as the world becomes more complex, we need to ask ourselves if this focus is still justified. Because something is increasingly replacing competitive advantage as the most important issue. And that something is what we call competitive survival. So we live in a time where the world becomes more complex and more companies struggle to survive. And not just any company, even big players, Nokia and other companies. So there are many examples of big, formerly successful companies that suddenly found themselves in situations struggling with competitive survival. So if you want, when we talk about a resource-based view of the firm, we talk about the resource material available to the senior managers. And quite often people refer to the so-called bathtub analogy, right? If you have a bathtub full of water, you have the hot water, cold water. So as a senior manager, you can control these two switches. So if you want, you have the power to increase the temperature or to decrease the temperature. So the change is possible, but it will always be a very slow change. So that is what we find in business reality as well. The only problem is that nowadays there's also a plug where the hole, you have to imagine like a crack or leak. So the water, the resource material available may become less, water value of the existing resource material may become less useful for competitive survival. That is the problem. So that is something we'll have to talk about today as well. Now, the red box you saw earlier, the internal analysis, that is called strategic capability. So this red box here. If we look at that in more detail, usually we find different elements to internal analysis. So we call them RBV, DCV, VC. What does VC stand for? Any idea? VC is obviously a framework by Michael Porter called value chain, right? So these are, if you want, the basic frameworks for internal analysis, or at least not necessarily the most useful ones, but the ones that you find in most internal analysis. So the resource-based view of the firm, the dynamic capabilities view of the firm, and then the value chain analysis. So now you have to ask yourself, if you conduct a strategic analysis, what else do you need to do a good job? And that is where the other 2 points come into case. First of all, we talk about this criticality. If you look at a case study organization, and especially with internal analysis, it's very important to be critical. Because if we are not critical, then we are unlikely to identify the weaknesses. If we don't identify the weaknesses, we are unlikely to offer a solution for competitive survival in the future. But this is all about competitive survival in the future. And competitive survival in the future means that we need to start thinking about the future early. And that is where we start thinking about the future when we conduct our internal analysis. So first of all, we want to identify the resource gap today. What are the resources available today to the senior managers? And as a second step, which resources are missing for competitive survival? So that is the process in theory. Now, just a few words about the resource-based view of the firm, which is still dominant today. It came into criticism, but it's still something that everyone talks about today. It first emerged in the 1980s with Birger-Bernfeld's paper in 1986. The most prominent author in the resource-based view of the firm is obviously J. Barney. Famous for his 1991 paper on the VIO framework. So the resource-based view of the firm, in very simple terms, what does it say? It basically tells you if you have a set of resources that fulfill certain criteria, then you are likely to achieve competitive advantage. That competitive advantage will be sustainable. And so the next question we need to ask ourselves, what is sustainable competitive advantage? What does sustainability mean? Ongoing, which means you can sustain it over a long period of time. That is one view. That is the view by Michael Porter here. And then we have obviously other people who have a different notion of sustainability, and they say sustainability means it cannot be copied, right? So it's unique resources that cannot be copied, therefore they can be sustained. So these are the two ideas on sustainability. And the whole resource-based view of the firm talks about that. So the resource-based view of the firm emerged in the 1980s, and in the 1980s, obviously, Michael Porter's theories were very important because Michael Porter was focused on industry attractiveness and external focus. And then in the 1990s, he saw how it turned over to more internal analysis. So in theory, that's a good idea to identify the resources that are unique. And if you're fortunate enough to have unique resources, then maybe you can have a sustainable competitive advantage. That's the whole idea. But now we need to talk about problems with this idea of the resource-based view of the firm. As you can see, many people have criticized the resource-based view of the firm of being tautological. So tautology is a statement that is always true. The sun rises every morning. Is that a theory or is that a tautological statement? Without leaving this room, we could now say the sun is either shining or it's not shining right now at this point in time. It will always be right. So that will not constitute a theory. Some people have argued that the resource-based view of the firm is not necessarily theoretical enough. But again, we need to ask ourselves if this is really important. Because the question if a resource-based view is a real theory or not is not as important as the question what is the actual practical value of the resource-based view to senior managers. So we had a whole debate going on, academic debate. Academic debates are always very interesting and entertaining. Right? So if you follow this debate, some people say yes, the RBB is good, other people say no, it's not good, it's tautological, and then it goes back and forth. And then a lot of time has passed, but not much progress has been made. And that is exactly what happened in 2001, when Jay Barney and Freeman Butler had a little battle in the Journal of Management. But that's an interesting debate that you should definitely follow. It's quite interesting to read that. But again, maybe they are all missing the point. Because, as I said before, competitive survival is the issue that is most important, apart from running one time. Okay, so the resource-based view of the firm should perhaps not be criticized for being tautological, but it can be criticized for focusing only on sustainable competitive advantage. Now, if a company is in trouble, the first and most important urgent issue is achievement of competitive survival. Competitive advantage is something that is also important, but not at that point in time. So, me and my colleagues, we argue that we need to focus more on competitive survival and less on competitive advantage. That is one of the problems of the resource-based view of the firm, but I will also talk about dynamic capabilities in a minute. Now, just to summarize the quick introduction to the resource-based view of the firm, Jay Barney himself provided this statement here in 2001. So he basically said, yes, the resource-based view of the firm has some problems, but it is a useful framework. It is a useful framework if we have an equilibrium. Now, the question is if any such equilibrium exists in business reality, or if we live in a very dynamic world. So given the state of the business world, we might have to question the value of the RBB as admitted here by Jay Barney. But that's just one side of the story. So we can't always say this is a good theory, this is a bad theory. The reality is always a bit more complex. So I would also like to talk about the usefulness of the RBB for senior managers in a few minutes. So when the RBB first emerged, it became very attractive. Later was criticized. Today we still talk about RBB in 2014. And there's a reason why we still talk about the resource-based view of the firm, because the resource-based view of the firm offers some useful tools for senior managers to understand their own resource base. Right? Their own resource base is toolkit. And there's no better way than some frameworks like the value chain to understand internal processes, but also the resource base of the firm, or resource analysis if you want, to identify tangible and intangible resources. Why is that so important? Because the internal view of the firm is extremely important when we talk about strategic fit. When we talk about strategic fit, we talk about the relation between the internally available resources and the external change. So if the two drift apart, then competitive survival is unlikely. Can you give me an example of a company that has not achieved competitive survival despite being quite a successful company in the past? Any example? Okay, do you know any companies that have been successful in the past? Full stop.
Till now?
In the past only?
In the past.
Okay, obviously you might want to think about these things because this is important. But I mentioned Nokia earlier. Okay, so Nokia used to be a very successful company just 15 years ago. Today, not very successful. Motorola is another example. Has been bought, acquired, sold again many times. But just 15 years ago, Motorola was a very successful company, big player, right? And if you look at the business world and the history of businesses, we can see there are many, many examples of companies that become very big, very successful, and then at one point in time, they suddenly go out of business or they lose it all. And that should make us think about future survival. Because it doesn't matter how important or how influential or how successful companies today, what senior managers are most interested in is future survival. At least they should be interested in that. And so, therefore, when we talk about dynamic capabilities, we now need to ask ourselves, dynamic capabilities, what is it? And how can it help senior managers to survive in the future? So here we have a very basic definition. Right? If you look at that definition, you can see there are some key words. What is probably the most important word on that slide? Yeah, that's extremely important. So it implies that we do something with the resource base. Now the question is, what happens to the resource base? The resource base, as I say, is here right now, today. Now when you conduct a future analysis of external factors, maybe using Pastel or any similar framework, then you identify how the world changes, and then you also identify how the future changes for one particular industry. For example, I saw some of your presentations yesterday, and you looked at the future of the industry. So now once you understand the future development, and you understand the current resource base, something has to happen because at that point in time you will identify the gap. Now there's one problem when we talk about future forecast, and that has something to do with human nature. Right? Human beings cannot predict the future. So our future analysis, or our external analysis, will never be 100% accurate. That is a big problem for senior managers. And different companies have different ways to deal with that. So there are usually two reactions, and both are very popular, and both are equally mistaken. Right? So if senior managers think perhaps that the world becomes too complex and there's too much change, as some of them say, we don't conduct any future forecasts anymore. Instead, all decisions are based on intuition. Right? And when that happens, that means that decisions are based on past decisions. And that can never be the right thing to do, because if the future is different than the past, then these decisions will be a mismatch. Right? So that's the first reaction to a complex world. The second reaction is to say, yes, the world is very complex, but what we have to do is we have to collect more data. So we can collect more and more data nowadays. We have the technological facilities. But when you collect more data, what is the problem? The problem is that you won't necessarily gain better insights. So it's a trade-off. It would be a waste of time to collect too much data because no one will actually ever analyze these data. So that is the problem in the world. And that is also reflected in the history of strategy in the 1960s, 1970s. Everyone thought technology can solve our problems. So basically people thought that computer models could actually solve the strategic decisions or make the strategic decisions for us. But today, more than ever, the role of the senior manager is important, because senior managers need to understand the environment, need to understand the future, and they need to make the right decision. So now I would like to talk about the right decision, and the question is, dynamic capability building, is that the right thing to do, yes or no? So in reality, what happens here? We can see the first two bullet points are exactly the first two things on the strategy process slide. You analyze internal resources, you analyze external factors, you try to understand your resource material, you try to understand the future change. So when we talk about strategic change, we need to distinguish that obviously from external change. External change happens all the time. And then the internal change, if you want, is the reaction to the external change, what you do to the resource material. The big question though, and that's why we can see this in red font, how can we transform the resource base? So how can we make sure that our resources are useful in the future? And that is the big question. The question is dynamic capabilities, and they actually answer this question. So first of all, if you look at what has happened so far since 1997, in 1997 there was a very influential article by a guy called David Thies and colleagues. And that was the first, if you want, big article on dynamic capabilities. And the basic idea was, you look at external change, you transform the resources somehow, and then you actually come up with some sort of useful capabilities. So when I say capability and resource, does anyone in the room know the difference between the two? What is the difference between resources and capabilities? Yep.
Resources can change through capabilities. So if a person has capabilities, they can use resources.
Exactly.
Change the resource or take them and produce something.
That's it, right? So we talk about resources and we talk about the resource deployment, how you utilize the resources. That's what we call capabilities. So you're absolutely right. And capabilities are not abilities. Ability is something you do. And maybe you're just lucky you do it once. Only if you as a senior manager can replicate the process, then we talk about capability. So therefore, by default, when we talk about dynamic capability building, you need to say we do something to our resource base. As a first step, you need to know what the resource base actually is. Right? So the problem with the dynamic capabilities view to date, first of all, research is not industry specific. There are many articles on dynamic capabilities, but there are very few articles that focus on one industry at a time. And those articles that don't focus on one industry at a time, they're very abstract, and as a result, they lack credibility, but also they lack practical applicability for senior managers. So that is one of the problems, not just with dynamic capabilities, but a common problem.
And the second problem, if you want, is that we still have this black box, dynamic capability building. We find many definitions in the literature, what are dynamic capabilities, but we find very few guidance, prescription, help for senior managers, how can we actually build dynamic capabilities. This is a big problem. The other big problem is the terminology. As often, different people publish different papers in academic journal articles. On a closer look, quite often they use a different terminology, but more or less talk about the same issue, right? One prime example, core competencies, distinctive capabilities. So that is quite a common problem in this discipline. Another one, as I said before, there are still many papers that frantically try to link dynamic capabilities with sustainable competitive advantage. And that is just not possible. Even now in 2014, that is still very obvious from the most recent strategic management journal articles. And so me and my colleague at Newcastle Business School, we conducted a study that began in 2006. And the idea was we want to actually try to avoid these drops. And we looked at one industry at a time. So we selected the Russian steel industry. And we selected that industry for a number of reasons. The biggest reason, 4 competitors and almost no competition. So traditionally 4 big players, Severstal, Novodevitsky, Martin Tukolsky, and Everest. And these 4 players, they were all located in one particular geographical part of the Russian Federation. And they actually, these 4 big players, they shared their activities, and they more or less said, like, we don't want competition. Everyone gets their own share of the pie, and that's it. That was the history, if you want. But then in 2006, there was a big M&A wave in the steel industry. So all of a sudden, these big players in Russia had to deal with competition externally for the first time. So we thought this is an interesting time to identify how do these managers now think about dynamic capabilities. Right? So what we also want to identify is the exploration and explanation of what and how. Because with dynamic capabilities, you can't make a clear decision before the study begins. You can't say, yes, I want to know what they are. To understand what they are, you also need to know how to build dynamic capabilities. So that was the outset of this study. So what we identified is, first of all, nothing new. We saw that there's a number of problems, as usual, and that has something to do with the threshold capability definition. So when we say the threshold capability definition, what we mean by that? To enter an industry, you need to fulfill minimum requirements. And these minimum requirements change over time. So companies can't stay in the game unless they understand how these minimum requirements change. So that is, if you want, a source of problems for some managers if they don't keep the eye on it. Another problem is that obviously, naturally, the more competitors you have, the more resource material you have within the industry. And that means that will have an impact on the threshold definition. What you see here on the slide might be interesting for you, given that I came here from Newcastle. This is the coastline near Newcastle, a place called Bidley Bay, 5 miles to the east. And what you can see on this photograph is obviously the sea. At the same time, you see some man-made barrier and structure. Okay, so this is a concrete wall. And that concrete wall is about 3 miles long. What do you think is the purpose of this concrete wall?
Maybe just save the land from erosion.
Yeah, that's one of the key reasons. Any other reasons? Obviously, just to make sure the houses are safe there, right? So to save the land from erosion. The other thing is, this is just to make sure that people can walk there without being in trouble. So we find it quite a lot, not just in England, English coastline, we find it all over the world. But at the same time, we use this as an analogy to explain the problem of this world. We have one big problem in this world, and that is time. Time is always the biggest killer. So this time can destroy people, can destroy buildings, can destroy the coastline. So the UK coastline is particularly at risk of being eroded over time. Obviously, when we say over time, we mean millions of years. So what people do is they try to build local barriers. And local barriers fulfill a function, and that usually works. But if you look at the whole coastline of the UK, it's impossible to have barriers like that apart from environmental impacts. So now if you go back to being a senior manager, you have one problem, as I said before, and that is you have resource material available, but over time, the value of that resource material will naturally decrease. So you can build barriers locally, but they will not stop the process. The process is inevitable. So as a senior manager, you need to accept the fact that your resources available today are useful today, but they may not actually be as useful in the future. So you have various options. One of them is to build new resources, or the second is just to not do anything, and then probably not be able to survive. So this is the practical problem. Now, in the steel industry, we identified that there are additional problems for senior managers, because even if they identify the need for change, they are stuck with some other problems, and the most important one, powerful path dependency. Anyone knows what we mean by path dependency? Path dependency, also called unique historical conditions, means a company traveled down a certain path in history, and because of that, they are successful. So everyone in this room, what you are today is the result of your past decisions. Same for companies, what they are today is the result of past decisions. But the problem is that past decisions lead to success, and success makes it unlikely to change, because everyone is trapped in their own paradigm of decision making that made them what they are today. And the same for companies. The more successful companies are, the less willing they are to change. And because they are less willing to change, that means that they are more or less, I'm sure you all heard the term capitalist trap. So that is a problem. The willingness to change is not there. On top of that, when we talk about path dependency, we find that companies, even if they want to change, it's actually very difficult, if not impossible, and that has something to do with the resources available. So for example, yesterday I know some of you visited a steel manufacturing facility. Now, these factories in the Russian steel industries are traditional low-quality steel factories, and they are not actually a very complex technology. At the same time, they are the basic foundation of the business today. So these big steel players in the Russian steel industry, we identified that even if they wanted to change, they couldn't quickly change on short notice because of the path dependency they're trapped in. Feasibility constraints, financial reasons, obviously also play a big role. So that is a big problem. And now if we use another analogy of rail tracks, if a company is traveling down a certain path in history, and the resource material available over time, the value will naturally decrease. So what happens is they know they're going down the wrong path. At the same time, they're unable to change direction. If you're on a train, the train cannot change direction quickly. It takes time for a start. Second, you're going down one-way track, you can go backwards, but you can't go in a fundamentally different direction. First of all, you have to build a new way track. That takes time. The same here. What we found in the Russian steel industry, first of all, there's no need for change. When we talk to the top senior managers like Alexei Mordashov, of Sevastopol, for example, we identified that there was no need for change whatsoever. and that there was a very short-term focus on the next 2 years maximum. So when asked what sort of external analysis do you conduct on a regular basis, the answer was no. Okay, so we don't need external analysis, we don't need future forecasts. We're successful now, we're profitable, so why should we be interested in these issues? And you would be shocked to see how many companies are actually talking about the same thing here. Yet at the same time, the world is changing. And there are many studies that show that we live in a hyper-competitive environment, in a high-velocity environment, that the world becomes more and more complex, faster and faster. So the change is a reality, and the speed of change is increasing. So if companies are not flexible enough to adapt to the external change, then there's a problem. And so going back to dynamic capability building, our task was to identify the dynamic capability building task in the Russian steel industry. We did not actually identify any evidence of dynamic capability building whatsoever. So in that respect, the study, the new insights gained from the study was that dynamic capability building is something that is currently not taking place in the Russian steel industry. Yet we identified that this is something that should take place in the Russian steel industry as well. But we also identified the blockages to dynamic capability building in practice. So the question is, how does it work in reality? First of all, we need to understand the practical barriers, and only then we can actually think about building capabilities. Also, when you look at this graph here, you can see, this is just as an analogy, there's a break point at one point in history, and that we know that from many other companies, at one point in history, it will be too late to turn back. And at that point in history, it's also too late to build capabilities, to change the resource base, to acquire new resources. So if companies are not careful, they will actually go out of business. So to cut a long story short, what we advocate is that we say competitive survival is the most pressing issue in strategy today. And there need to be more studies that look at competitive survival. Competitive advantage is less important today than maybe it was 20 years ago. At the same time, dynamic capability building is still a big unknown, and there need to be further studies. So anyone who's interested in going into that direction, there's a lot of research to be done in the future. Okay, thank you very much, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Capabilities we're looking at, they have to be developed. We have to look at them from a change perspective. Is there really, or where is the real difference of the dynamic capability view as compared to the starting point of the whole resource-based discussion?
The starting point of the resource-based discussion is more about the identification of the resources themselves. So if we look at the literature and the resource-based view, there's very little about changing the resource base. So it's about identification of resources. So what we criticize is that there's no real tangible link between the external view and the internal view within the internal resource-based view. On the other hand, the dynamic capabilities view has this explicit link, but lacks any practical detail. So I think it comes to our question to say that we need to look at both.
Did you find out any solutions how firms can use their capabilities more useful?
Sorry, can you rephrase the question, please?
Did you find out any solutions about that topic? How maybe in the steel industry in Russia, how they can use their capabilities inside the firm more useful?
Yeah, I mean, when we were actually shocked when we looked at some companies, for example, Style, that there was no motivation whatsoever to build capabilities or to do anything with the resources available. When they talk about the resources, they also only talk about the tangible resources, like the manufacturing plants and so on, because that was the core of the business. So, no future forecast, no inclination to do anything. That was the shocking result of our study.
So normally it would mean that at the point of time, maybe all of the companies will go out of business if they can't change or if they can't adopt anything.
Not all companies will go out of business, but we can definitely say that the number of companies going out of business in the future will increase because it will become more and more important and difficult to achieve basic competitive survival over a 5-year period, 10-year period. And that could even hit big companies that no one would think of today, like Apple, for example. Right? Even big players will go out of business in the future. And that has something to do with the change that we experience.
You spoke about Motorola, which used to be one of the big players in the mobile phone business, and they lost the business. Could you give us a forecast which company, based on your research, will be prepare better for the future, Samsung or Apple?
My personal view is Samsung, because Apple as a company, I see that crossing going already on a downward trend right now. Because if we look at the past performance in cycles, 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, in 2004, Apple suddenly became very successful again. And the question is, why did they become successful in 2004? Was it because they were doing the right thing at the right time? Or was it because 5 years earlier, 7 years earlier, they identified the technological change and prepared accordingly? So I don't see much future forecast and innovation happening at Apple right now. So based on that logic, they will be in trouble again in 5 years' time. But obviously that's just a prediction.
Another question. So when you said that some companies will go out of business, so that means you can't change will go on. So that means when companies go out of business, only just new companies or startup companies can step into the old steps of the other companies and go on with the change. So it's just like start new, go out of business, a new company will grow. Or
what happens is different things. Some companies will not be able to survive within the industry, within the existing industry, simply because entry barriers change, because of new competitors, for example. The second problem is that some industries become obsolete, so entire industries will also disappear. I always talk about the same example, American locomotive company. That was the most successful company world for steam locomotives. And in about 1940, someone in that company said there's a new technology coming along, we should really switch to electric train technology, different type of locomotives, but they decided against it. And then for 30 years they continued to exist, so that was a slow demise, and then in the 1970s they went out of business. So the managers saw the change coming, but they decided to ignore it. And in that context, we quite often talk about the difference between the slow external change and the sudden change. And quite often the slow change is more dangerous to companies because it's so slow and therefore so difficult to identify. It's like getting older. You get older every day. One day you wake up and you're maybe much older than you were previously. But every day you don't see the change, right? So it's the same for companies. The slower the external change, the more difficult to identify.
How did the managers in the Russian steel companies, the senior managers, react when they learned about your research and your conclusion? Probably they didn't really like it, but how did they react?
I mean, they were also interested in the results of the study, but I don't think they took it particularly serious, because why should they? This is just some study, they're making money, as they say, we make money today. So unfortunately we saw a certain complacency in this company, self-complacency, maybe arrogance, and quite often that is the first step before a company goes down. So they didn't take these results on board, unfortunately.
Yes, thank you very much. I think this was a very interesting insight in the research, in the theory, and also the application. Thank you for these insights. And there are no further questions, so last call for a question. Then I'd say thank you very much. And thank you in Heilbronn means we do this with a very tangible object. So there are some capabilities in the area which are developed over a long time, and it is one cultivation, and this is the outcome. So we hope this is not a dying industry. So we hope we do not oversee all the signals, but at least we hope you will test the product and the outcome, and you will like it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.